At the edge of the Amazon, the Earth's lungs were about to stop breathing. High above the canopy, a silent, odorless cloud of methane was escaping from a forgotten tectonic fissure, turning a 50-mile radius into a powder keg. If a single spark hit that cloud, the resulting firestorm would erase an entire ecosystem and accelerate global warming by a decade. The world's multi-million-dollar satellite sensors were calibrated for smoke, but they couldn't see the invisible gas. They were blind to the catastrophe. But Pip, a 3-pound rescue Capuchin monkey with a scarred nose, could see the air changing. This is the story of the monkey who raced against a thermal explosion to save the heart of our planet. Title: The Invisible Spark, the Monkey. Who saved the Earth's lungs? Chapter 1: The Methane Ghost. Deep within the untouched layers of the Amazon rainforest, a geological nightmare was unfolding. A methane ghost, a massive pocket of ancient gas trapped since the prehistoric era, had been unleashed by a minor seismic shift. This wasn't a fire, it was a transparent wall of death. The gas moved through the trees like a phantom, displacing oxygen and silencing the birds. To the human rangers at the edge of the park, the forest looked peaceful, but in reality, the canopy was becoming a massive, unexploded bomb. The sensors at the Global Climate Watch station were designed to detect carbon and heat, but methane is a silent killer. It doesn't register on standard thermal imaging until it's already burning. The rangers went about their day, unaware that the air they were breathing was reaching a flashpoint. If the midday sun hit a piece of quartz on the forest floor, the resulting spark would trigger a chain reaction that would burn 100,000 acres in seconds, releasing enough carbon to accelerate global warming by a decade. Amidst this silent crisis lived Pip. He was a Capuchin monkey who had been rescued from a laboratory and returned to a protected sanctuary. Because of his time in the lab, Pip's senses were hyper-tuned to chemical changes. Capuchins have a specialized olfactory bulb that is 40% larger than other primates of their size. Pip didn't just smell the air, he felt the density of the molecules. To him, the forest no longer smelled of damp earth and orchids, it smelled of danger. As the sun reached its zenith, Pip felt the air grow heavy. The methane was pooling in the low-lying valleys of the canopy, creating a pressure wave that only he could detect. He watched as a group of researchers began to set up a campfire for lunch just a mile away from the fissure. They were about to strike the match that would end the world as they knew it. Pip let out a high-pitched chirp scream, a sound of absolute terror that cut through the humidity of the jungle. The lead researcher, a biologist named Dr. Aries, heard the cry but ignored it, thinking it was just a territorial dispute between monkeys. He reached into his pocket for his lighter, intending to start a small fire for their midday meal. He had no idea that he was standing in the middle of a fuel-air explosive. But Pip wasn't going to let him strike that flame. The monkey dived from a 100-foot mahogany tree, his tail acting as a safety line, as he began a suicide sprint through the poisoned air to reach the camp. Chapter 2: The Chemical Navigator. Pip's journey was a race against suffocation. Because methane is lighter than air but pools in stagnant pockets, the higher Pip climbed, the more he risked entering a dead zone where oxygen didn't exist. His vision began to tunnel, and his muscles burned with lactic acid. But Pip had a biological advantage: chemosensory mapping. He could see the veins of the gas moving through the wind, visualized as a shimmering distortion in the light. He navigated by hopping between pockets of clean air, moving like a shadow through a minefield of invisible poison. At the camp, Dr. Aries struggled with his lighter. The wind was swirling, and the flame wouldn't catch, a blessing from the earth that the man didn't yet understand. The methane concentration was now at 4%, just 1% away from the lower explosive limit. Pip reached the perimeter of the camp, his lungs screaming for air. He didn't have the strength to fight the humans, so he did the only thing he could: he began to destroy their equipment with a calculated fury. He leaped onto the camp table, knocking over the water jugs and scattering the dry tinder they had painstakingly collected. The researchers shouted in anger, trying to shoo the crazy monkey away with their hats. "He's lost it! He's gone rabid!" Aries yelled, reaching for his lighter again. But every time Aries tried to strike the flint, Pip would dive at his hand, biting at the air and screeching with a ferocity that stopped the biologist in his tracks. Pip was risking a bullet to stop a spark. Pip then did something remarkable that stopped the shouting. He grabbed Dr. Araz's GPS device and began to beat it against a rock, then pointed toward the valley below. He wasn't just being destructive, he was trying to force them to look at the behavior of the forest. Ares finally noticed, the insects had stopped buzzing. The jaguars had fled. The forest was holding its breath. Pip grabbed a handful of dry leaves and threw them into the air. They didn't fall, they floated on the dense, heavy gas. Ares finally understood. He was a scientist, and the signs were suddenly undeniable. He looked at Pip, whose nose was bleeding from the atmospheric pressure, and then at the lighter in his hand. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Of clean air, moving like a shadow through a minefield of invisible poison. At the camp, Dr. Ares struggled with his lighter. The wind was swirling, and the flame wouldn't catch, a blessing from the earth that the man didn't yet understand. The methane concentration was now at 4%, just 1% away from the lower explosive limit. Pip reached the perimeter of the camp, his lungs screaming for air. He didn't have the strength to fight the humans, so he did the only thing he could. He began to destroy their equipment with a calculated fury. He leaped onto the camp table, knocking over the water jugs and scattering the dry tinder they had painstakingly collected. The researchers shouted in anger, trying to shoo the crazy monkey away with their hats. "He's lost it. He's gone rabid," Ares yelled, reaching for his lighter again. But every time Ares tried to strike the flint, Pip would dive at his hand, biting at the air and screeching with a ferocity that stopped the biologist in his tracks. Pip was risking a bullet to stop a spark. Pip then did something remarkable that stopped the shouting. He grabbed Dr. Araz's GPS device and began to beat it against a rock, then pointed toward the valley below. He wasn't just being destructive, he was trying to force them to look at the behavior of the forest. Ares finally noticed, the insects had stopped buzzing. The jaguars had fled. The forest was holding its breath. Pip grabbed a handful of dry leaves and threw them into the air. They didn't fall, they floated on the dense, heavy gas. Ares finally understood. He was a scientist, and the signs were suddenly undeniable. He looked at Pip, whose nose was bleeding from the atmospheric pressure, and then at the lighter in his hand. The realization hit him like a physical blow. They weren't in a paradise, they were in a gas chamber. He shouted for his team to drop everything and run. No sparks. No electronics. Move. Leave the gear, he screamed, his voice cracking with a sudden, sharp fear. Chapter 3, The 60-Second Escape. The evacuation was a desperate scramble through the undergrowth. Pip didn't flee into the high trees, he stayed on the ground, nipping at the heels of the researchers to keep them moving toward the higher, windswept ridges. The methane was now so thick that the researchers began to feel lightheaded, their coordination failing. Pip acted as a living compass, pushing them away from the gravity wells where the gas was most concentrated. Behind them, the unthinkable happened. A single, dry branch snapped under the weight of a falling fruit, striking a flint-rich stone on the forest floor. A small puff of blue flame erupted, a localized ignition. The fire didn't spread along the ground, it traveled upward into the invisible cloud. Because Pip had prevented the campfire, there was no massive central heat source to trigger a total detonation, but the atmospheric burn had begun. The team reached the safety of the rocky ridge just as a low-frequency thrum shook the earth. It wasn't an explosion, but a slow burn of the methane cloud. Above the trees, the air itself seemed to shimmer and ripple with a ghostly blue light. It was a terrifyingly beautiful sight, an aurora borealis made of fuel. If they had stayed in the camp, the oxygen in their lungs would have been consumed by the blue flame in seconds. Dr. Ares watched through binoculars as his camp equipment was melted by the invisible heat. The heat was so intense it began to blister the bark of the trees, but because the gas was burning off in the high canopy, the forest floor remained intact. The mist sprinklers at the nearby station finally triggered, saturated the air with moisture and breaking the gas's chemical bond. The forest had been saved by a margin of 60 seconds. Pip slumped onto a rock, his small body shivering with exhaustion. He had inhaled a lethal amount of methane, and his heart was struggling to compensate for the lack of oxygen. Dr. Aries didn't reach for a camera or a notebook. He reached for his medical kit. He administered pure oxygen to the tiny hero, cradling the monkey in his arms while the blue fire danced above them. In that moment, the barrier between species vanished. There was only gratitude. Chapter 4: The Silent Sentinel. In the weeks following the Amazon burn, the global scientific community was in an uproar. Satellite footage had captured the blue shimmer, but it hadn't detected the gas until it was already ignited. The world realized that their billion-dollar climate monitors had a blind spot that could have ended the Amazon as we know it. They realized that the only reason the rainforest hadn't become a moonscape was a 3-pound Capuchin with a laboratory-scarred nose. Pip was taken to a world-class veterinary facility in Brasilia, where he was treated for lung damage. He became a symbol of the Sentinels of the Wild, a movement dedicated to protecting animals who act as early warning systems for planetary disasters. The guests at his recovery center included heads of state and environmentalists, but Pip remained indifferent to the fame. He only cared about the smell of the wind and the humidity of the trees. Dr. Aries published a groundbreaking paper titled The Pip Phenomenon, which proved that primates could detect methane leaks with 99% more accuracy than infrared sensors. This led to a massive shift in how the Amazon was protected. Biosentinel stations were established, where rescued primates lived in semi-wild conditions, their movements monitored by non-invasive AI to detect environmental shifts before they became disasters. The area where the methane had leaked was sealed and transformed into the Pip Sanctuary. The tectonic fissure was stabilized, but the lesson remained. Humanity had built a world of metal and glass, but it was still dependent on the ancient wisdom of the fur and the feather. Every time the wind blew through that valley, the locals were reminded that they were breathing because a monkey refused to let them strike a match. For Pip, the reward was simple: he was returned to his mahogany tree. He sat on the highest branch, his golden brown fur glowing in the sun, watching the horizon. He knew this methane ghost was still down there, sleeping beneath the roots. He knew the earth was a living, breathing thing that sometimes coughed in its sleep. And he was ready to scream again if he had to. Chapter 5: The Laboratory Legacy. As Pip aged, his story took on a new layer of depth. Scientists discovered that Pip's hypersensitivity wasn't just a natural trait, it was a result of his time in the laboratory. The very place that had caused him pain had accidentally given him the tools to save the world. It was a poetic irony that touched millions. The survivor of human cruelty had become the savior of human survival. Elias, a young ranger inspired by Pip's story, took over the sanctuary's management. He noticed that Pip had begun to teach his younger monkeys. He would lead them to certain plants and teach them to scent the air near the seismic vents. This wasn't just instinct anymore, it was a culture of protection. The Capuchins of the Pip Sanctuary were becoming the first environmental engineers of the animal kingdom. The GPS device that Pip had smashed was placed in a museum in London. It sits behind glass, its screen cracked and its casing dented by small, powerful teeth. It serves as a reminder that our most advanced tools are useless if we lose our connection to the living world. Millions of children visit the exhibit every year, learning that being small doesn't mean you can't stop a giant disaster. Dr. Aries and Pip remained close until the very end. Aries would visit the sanctuary every month, bringing Pip's favorite fruit and sitting in silence at the base of his tree. They didn't need words to communicate. The biologist would look at the thriving green canopy and then at the old monkey, knowing that every leaf and every vine was a gift from a friend. The invisible spark had changed the world's perspective on the Amazon. It was no longer just a resource or a lung, it was a partner. People started to realize that protecting the forest wasn't just about saving trees, it was about saving the voices that live within them. The methane was gone, but the spirit of the sentinel remained, guarding the heart of the planet with every breath. Chapter 6: The Final Breath of the Forest. Years passed, and eventually, the time came for Pip to take his final rest. On a warm, humid evening, Pip climbed to his favorite branch one last time. He looked out over the vast, green sea of the Amazon, watching the fireflies dance in the twilight. The forest was healthy. The air was pure. The blue fire was a distant memory. He closed his eyes, his heart slowing to the rhythm of the falling rain. When the rangers found him the next morning, they didn't see a dead animal, they saw a legend at peace. In an unprecedented move, the Brazilian government declared a national day of mourning. For 1 minute, all logging and industrial activity in the Amazon stopped. The silence was absolute, a final tribute to the monkey who had kept the forest breathing. Pip was buried at the base of the great mahogany tree, his grave marked only by a simple stone and a sapling of an orchid. But his story didn't end with his death. The Pip protocol is now used in every rainforest on Earth. From the Congo to Indonesia, rangers now listen to the chirp screams of the primates, knowing that they are the first line of defense against the invisible threats of a changing climate. The mahogany tree grew taller and stronger, its roots drinking from the earth that Pip had saved. Some say that on the hottest days, when the methane tries to rise again, a phantom chirp can still be heard in the canopy. The locals believe it is Pip's spirit, still patrolling the invisible veins of the wind. The forest is safe, not because the danger is gone, but because the lesson of the sentinel is never forgotten. As the sun sets over the Amazon today, a new generation of Capuchin sits in the high branches. They sniff the air, their whiskers twitching in the breeze. They are the heirs to a legacy of bravery, the guardians of the invisible spark. And somewhere in the rustle of the leaves, the voice of a 3-pound hero continues to whisper, "Listen to the earth, for it is the only home we have." Technology told them the forest was safe. Pip told them they were standing in a gas chamber. If he hadn't broken that GPS, the Amazon would be a memory. If you believe that every living creature has a purpose, hit that like button and subscribe right now. The question of the day: do you think we should trust animal instincts more than our own technology? Tell me why or why not in the comments. I respond to every single one. Don't let Pip's legend fade into the canopy. Click the notification bell and I'll see you in the next epic survival story.